welcome everybody to the. Thank you. It's everybody else. She wants to welcome. To the fourth of our sixth CERC seminars this semester. And before I introduce Kelly, I'd like to just tell you about the other two. Dr. James Gomez, who's associate professor at the International College, Beijing Normal University, and the Hong Kong Baptist University in Zhuhai, China, will be speaking on the 23rd of this month about democratic discourses, the impact of human rights protection in Southeast Asia. And I might add that James is a Singaporean, and there's some interesting events going on in Singapore, as some of you who are following the news, about a great teacher there who is not feeling well at the moment. So it'd be pretty, I think, interesting to hear about that. Then we have a seminar in April on the 20th entitled Intimate Colonialism, Family Law and Anti-Asian Racism in Colonial Burma, Southeast Asia and beyond. And that's Dr. Chai Ikia, am I pronouncing it right? She's associate professor of history at Rutgers University. So all invited to that, both of those seminars. But today we're particularly pleased to have Kelly. Gerard is our speaker. Kelly is known to many of you here because she's been a visiting fellow at CERC, for which we're very grateful. Welcome, welcome. It's been great that she's been here on a Endeavor Fellowship, Endeavor Chung Kong Research Fellowship, which has provided her with the funding to come here. CERC's modest funds have not been much help, but it's been great to have Kelly here. She's an assistant professor at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Western Australia. Her research is about political economy, social movements, and governance in Southeast Asia. And she's just published ASEAN's Engagement of Civil Society Regulated Dissent, that's Palgrave 2014, and she's published in a number of prestigious journals, Pacific Review, Contemporary Politics and Globalizations. Besides her PhD, which was also from the University of Western Australia, she just completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Asia Research Center at Murdoch University, with which we have close ties as well. So Kelly, it's great to have you here generally, and in particular today for you giving this talk. Thanks very much.
I should stand to protect my voice. I did lose my voice last week, so I apologise in advance if it's going to start disappearing again. Thanks to Mark very much for facilitating my stay here for 6 months at SARC. It's been great. And I must note that this research, as Mark said, has been funded by the Australian Government through an Endeavour Research Fellowship, Hong Kong Research Fellowship. It's part of a broader project looking at ASEAN's various new rights agencies that it's established in recent years, looking at the form and function of these various new groups. Okay, so this paper looks in particular at the ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers. So over the past decade, ASEAN has taken on this very ambitious reform program, particularly its establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community, which is an integrated and liberal market that's commenced from the end of 2015. This integrated market is entailing the free movement of goods and services and the freer movement of capital and labour. But labour is the area of least progress within the development of the ASEAN Economic Community. There's been some progress in facilitating high-wage migration, but very little progress in facilitating low-wage migration. I use those two terms, high-wage and low-wage migration, rather than skilled and semi-skilled or unskilled or low-skilled low-skilled labour migration, because that second category of terms is often used in a pejorative sense, and it's also frequently not reflective of migrants' qualifications. It's not unusual for migrants to relocate for work in employment that doesn't reflect their qualifications. So I use the terms high wage and low wage migration which is reflective of the Singaporean and Malaysian government's structuring of entitlements based on monthly salaries. So labour areas is the area of least progress in developing the ASEAN economic community. So I'm interested in two broad questions in this paper. How can we explain ASEAN's quite different approaches to governing high and low wage migration, some progress in high wage migration, little to no progress in facilitating low wage migration, and also then it's part of a broader interest in looking at what we can expect from the commencement of the ASEAN economic community when it does commence at the end of 2015. So the existing literature in this area documents, there's a lot of studies documenting states' governance of labour migration at the state level, very little looking at it at a regional level, so this paper's contributing to that literature. So today, what I'm going to do is provide first a brief synopsis of ASEAN's activities in this area of facilitating labour migration, look at prevailing explanation for why there's been little progress in the area of low wage migration, some of the limitations I think that exist in this, and then the approach that how that's informed the approach that I take in the paper. Then look at some of the characteristics of intra-ASEAN labour migration. Then comparing the negotiation process for high and low wage migration, and finally explaining these different approaches by looking at the intersection of domestic political exigencies in shaping what's taking place in ASEAN. So just to provide you with a brief overview of what's taken place in ASEAN over the past decade and a half. After the ASEAN economic community, after the ASEAN economic crisis, it generated a rapid contraction in growth, a spike in prices for food and consumer goods, widespread unemployment, and a decline in the value of real wages. Particularly for those that were employed in the export-oriented industrial and service sectors, and the crisis also very much challenged the legitimacy of those countries most affected by it, notably in ASEAN, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. So these countries were facing criticism from a bolder and much better educated middle class, and that were challenging the paternalistic order of the past. So it was in the context of these criticisms against criticisms of some states, and also criticisms of ASEAN, that ASEAN embarked on this significant reform agenda to develop the ASEAN economic community. ASEAN was the institution that was at the heart of the 1990s East Asian boom. It was considered the exemplar of regional organisations in the developing world. But then it was very conspicuously absent from the recovery process after the crisis. It only just established an ASEAN free trade area. So it didn't have the short-term lending capacity that was required by states to halt the decline that then led to the involvement of the IMF. So this raised a lot of questions about ASEAN, its practices, its purposes, what it was doing really. And it was in this context that ASEAN then developed this community building project based on three pillars. So one of those being the ASEAN economic community, single integrated market, the ASEAN political security community, and the ASEAN socio-cultural community. So it's within the ASEAN economic community that there's been this agreement that states will facilitate the movement of business persons, skilled labour and talent, and they've pursued this by developing skill recognition arrangements and also a regional qualifications recognition framework. So alongside this deepening of economic integration, there's also been this push for some form of political integration through states' considered embrace of some rights, one of those being migrant workers' rights. So this came about with the Vientiane Action Program that was agreed in 2004, where states indicated that they're going to develop an instrument governing the rights of migrant workers. Then after that, they established a committee that was in charge of this, and they also established a separate policy consultation forum, the ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labour. 8 years after states agreed that they would start looking at developing an instrument on migrant workers' rights, the negotiations have actually regressed and have reached a stalemate. So we can see that there's very different approaches to governing high wage and low wage migration in ASEAN, but it's ASEAN's governance of migrant workers' rights that's of key relevance for intra-ASEAN migration, given that most of it is irregular and low wage. Now, existing explanations for the stalemate in ASEAN's governance of low wage migration look at two factors: ASEAN's norm of consensus and non-interference, and recipient states' lack of political will. So it's argued that ASEAN's failure to protect migrant workers' rights has come about because of states' unwillingness to interfere in one another's affairs, and it's hoped that through quintessential ASEAN consultation, some scholars have argued that this will generate a change within the institution. On the second factor, it's argued that recipient states' objections to protecting migrant workers' rights is a consequence of a lack of political will, which is attributed to poor public perceptions of migrant workers, and this then limits support amongst domestic constituencies for protecting migrant workers' rights. I think that these accounts overlooked two things. They neglect analysis of whose interests are advanced by the invoking of particular norms. So in arguing that ASEAN is not doing anything in this area because of its preference for consensus decision making or not interfering in one another's affairs, really overlooks whose interests are advanced by doing this. And Lee Jones's work in this area has really looked at how norms, in particular the norm of non-interference, has been used historically by states to advance particular political agendas. They very happily intervene in one another's affairs in particular issues, typically taking down political dissidents, often under the guise of communist insurgencies. So it's a question of whose norms are advanced by these, whose interests are advanced by the invoking of these norms, and then how that shapes how these norms are then implemented. I think this is important in looking at explaining the form and function of these norms rather than simply describing their occurrence. Second, this idea that recipient states lack the political will as explaining why nothing is taking place in the protection of migrant workers' rights. It also assumes that there's a zero-sum relationship between what happens in the regional space and what happens in the domestic space. So where ASEAN is considered to override some state functions, or states must hand over some form of power to a supranational entity. So it's this analytical dualism is born from a neo-Weberian view of states as abstract entities that stand above and do things to their societies, rather than looking at regional and domestic scales of governance as this relationship being mutually constitutive and interwoven process between domestic political projects and the form and function of regional governance. So in this paper then I take I'm drawing on a branch of Materialist Theory that's associated with Nexus and Bob Jessup in conceiving of the state as a social relation. So the form that states take is understood as being socially constituted, meaning it's structured through conflicts between competing interests. This defines the form and function that states take. So this approach is recognising that state power is as understood as being wielded in ways that privilege particular interests over others, what Jessup refers to as strategic selectivity. Importantly, this approach also recognises that state borders don't constitute a boundary for political power, and that domestic political projects are interwoven, can be interwoven with the form and function of regional governance. So, drawing on the work of political geographers looking at state building and regionalism as part of the same political project, namely the spatial and institutional organisation of political rule. So, I examine data that's taken from government departments, international organisations, NGOs, alongside a series of elite interviews that I conducted in late 2011, early 2012, in looking at how the form and function of regional and domestic governance have been interwoven through ASEAN's governance of labour migration. So, looking at a few characteristics of labour migration in Southeast Asia. Since the 1990s, we've seen labour migration increasingly shift from the Middle East to intra-ASEAN migration. It's also become increasingly intra-ASEAN migration. So of the 9.5 million migrants in Southeast Asia, in 2013, according to UN data, 6.5 million of those came from other ASEAN states. Countries can be categorised as predominantly labour recipient or labour sending countries, which we can see here. So Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, and Myanmar, predominantly labour sending countries. Singapore, Thailand, predominantly labour recipient countries. Malaysia is the only one with more comparable levels of migrants in and migrants out. But importantly, when we look at the composition of those flows, of the 1,049,780 migrants leaving Malaysia, almost all of those are going to Singapore, which represents then a much more skilled migration, high-wage migration, going to Singapore as opposed to low-wage migration. So it puts Malaysia much more in the category like Singapore and Thailand. Singapore and Thailand is predominantly the characteristics of that of those migrants as a labour recipient country. Stocks are highly concentrated, which we can see here. Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand as the key labour recipient countries in ASEAN comprise 97% of migrants within ASEAN. And then if we look at the countries of origin, so it's mainly Indonesia. So there's 5 key corridors for intra-ASEAN migration: Indonesia to Malaysia, Malaysia to Singapore, and then Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar going across to Thailand. And so that comprises 88% of intra-ASEAN migration. I think the next highest after that is Myanmar to Malaysia. So there's a significant emphasis on key corridors within ASEAN. The majority of intra-ASEAN migration is irregular. Irregular migration meaning that it takes place outside of the regulatory framework within sending, recipient and transient countries. And importantly, irregular migration, remembering that it's distinct from illegal migration, which typically refers to trafficking and smuggling. So it's taking place outside of the migration rules and regulations within the sending, transit and receiving countries. The majority of intra-ASEAN labour migration migrants have only primary education. It's also highly gendered. Women employed in specific occupations, notably domestic work, entertainment workers and nurses, and men predominantly in construction, manufacturing, agriculture, fisheries and forestry. So women often face what the ILO have termed double discrimination, being a woman and being a migrant worker, and the nature of their work also, as known particularly as domestic workers, lends itself more significantly to exploitation, given the isolated nature of that employment. And the recruitment industry finally has become increasingly commercialised. You can see this particularly in Singapore and Malaysia, where recruitment agencies have been able to act as employers. So they then manage the financing of recruitment and migration and then pass these costs on to the migrant workers. This then often generates a situation where migrant workers are tied to the recruitment agency as their employer, finding themselves bound to their employer. So, as I said before, ASEAN signed this Declaration on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers in January 2007, committing states to developing an instrument governing migrant workers' rights. They then put together this committee. The committee then put together a drafting team. The drafting team comprised 2 members from labour recipient countries and 2 members from labour sending countries. So 2 from the Philippines and Indonesia, and 2 from Malaysia and Thailand. They first met in April 2009, and then by the 3rd meeting, negotiations had stalled. And it stalled over 3 key issues. First, whether or not the instrument would be legally binding. That would be particularly important if you're talking about protecting migrant workers' rights. So Malaysia didn't want the instrument to be legally binding. Whether or not it would cover irregular migrant workers, and finally, whether or not it will cover migrant workers' families. So negotiations fell apart after that. The drafting team was expanded in a bid to resolve this deadlock, and so it then included 1 representative from each country, so 10 people sitting down at the drafting table. What then happened was that the 10 representatives put forward everything that they would like to see in the instrument, so a wish list of recommendations. And what we can see through that is that negotiations have regressed because every country then says ideally what they want in the instrument, and countries have been pushed further away from developing a consensus. So while these negotiations have been going on as well, the ASEAN Secretariat has been a little bit protected from having to comment on this by saying that negotiations are taking place and the drafting process is still going on, and therefore this issue is still being addressed. And so they've declined to comment on what's taking place in the development of the instrument. So despite ASEAN's various commitments to protecting migrant workers' rights, we've seen agreement at the regional level, in fact, regress with this 0 draft. Now this political impasse compares quite sharply with what's taken place in facilitating high-wage migration. What ASEAN members have done is they've negotiated mutual recognition arrangements for 6 professions. The earliest were signed in 2005, the most recent in 2012. They've also signed 2 framework arrangements in accounting and surveying. And these are distinct. The mutual recognition arrangements are considered a first step towards skill recognition amongst member states. Framework arrangements are a further step towards implementation in that they're more institutionalised. There's a more extensive laying out of what is actually going to take place in facilitating the movement of people employed in those professions. And importantly, the framework arrangements adopt a 2+X approach, meaning that countries not all countries have to agree, only 2 countries have to agree before they can then can proceed with implementing the agreement. So for all of these agreements, the arrangements and the framework agreements, they're underpinned by a joint sectoral committee, and each has agreed common curricula, competency standards, monitoring committees and certification boards. So there's quite a substantial degree of collaboration among the relevant national agencies in developing these things. So in high-wage migration, ASEAN member states have found it quite easy to say, well, we don't have to worry about the norm of non-interference in developing these things, and also in adopting the 2+X approach, we don't have to worry about consensus decision making. So we can see these very differing approaches to managing high and low wage migration. They also agreed a qualification reference framework that is intended to build pathways across careers for ASEAN citizens for particular qualifications, and that's also been agreed. So we can see these very differing approaches to governing high and low wage migration in establishing the ASEAN economic community. What I then do in the paper is examine the underlying social and political conflicts in explaining ASEAN's these differing approaches to governing high and low wage migration, and charting the intersection between domestic political exigencies and regional governance. Often overlooked in discussions of labour migration is the benefits of labour migration for both sending and recipient countries. So in recipient countries, the public debate normally focuses on social adjustments that are necessary, wage and welfare implications, but recipient states benefit quite significantly from labour migration, as do sending states. These benefits that are conferred on sending and recipient states, I think, are crucial in explaining the political impasse in governing migrant workers' rights and ASEAN's differing approaches to governing high and low wage migration. So, recipient states in ASEAN, what we can see is a consistent pattern of tolerating irregular migration, followed by amnesties and clamping down, programs to clamp down on irregular migrants. So, for recipient countries, they benefit from low-wage labour migration by increasing the participation of women in the workforce through the employment of domestic workers. In the case of Thailand, the employment of migrant workers has lowered labour costs significantly and made Thai exports more competitive, which has also enabled Thai workers to upskill through employment in higher skill sectors. Some governments, notably Malaysia and Singapore, have also directly benefited through the subjective levies that are applied to firms employing migrant workers, which are generally passed on either in part or in full to the migrant workers themselves. And skilled migration obviously represents a significant windfall for recipient countries. So, going through the labour recipient countries, what we see in Singapore, they've structured entitlements according to monthly salaries. So a personalised employment pass for migrant workers is for those earning in excess of 18,000 Singapore dollars per month. They can change jobs, bring families and apply for permanent residency. Those that have a university degree but don't earn as much, the employment pass, they can bring families and apply for permanent residency. But low-wage migrants are kept on a revolving door policy so those that are employed in construction, manufacturing, marine, process and service sectors, and also domestic workers, they are employed only on a transient basis, which enables the government then to increase numbers during economic upturns and decrease numbers during economic downturns. Now, Malaysia, similar story, structuring entitlements according to monthly salaries. The reliance of the Malaysian economy was demonstrated quite clearly during the 2005 Ops Tegas, which was a clampdown on irregular migrants, the translation being Operation Firmness. So in this particular clampdown, 350,000 migrants left during the amnesty period. They were largely from Indonesia. They left during the amnesty period, and then another 400,000 disappeared in Malaysia itself, not showing up for work because this was also the first time that the highly controversial citizen volunteer corps, RELA, was used. RELA is mandated to stop, search and detain suspected irregular migrants and also bear arms. So this was the first time that particular voluntary citizen corps was used. So we saw all these migrants disappear in Malaysia for fear of raids at their workplaces. Now, employers very quickly got upset about the disappearance of migrant workers because of the significant costs on their businesses, and the Malaysian government responded by not only reversing the policy, but also incentivising Indonesian workers to come back to Malaysia. So they very quickly approved the return of 169,000 migrant workers, and they set up 11 processing centres in Indonesia to facilitate the movement of workers back to Malaysia. And then they also, in overturning a recent reform to immigration law, allowed Indonesian workers to re-enter on tourist visas. So the Oxtake has very clearly demonstrated the centrality of low-wage migrants to the Malaysian economy, and this oscillation between tolerating irregular migration and tightening restrictions. Thailand has operated a similar process of allowing irregular migration and clamping down on it according to economic conditions. And it's also signed memorandums of understanding with Cambodia, Myanmar and Vietnam. Importantly, the effectiveness of these MOUs have been highly questioned, particularly in that they have been argued to encourage irregular migration by the increased costs associated with the application process that's generated through the MOUs. So it's been argued that Thailand's migration policy has very much been characterised as pro-employer. When we look at sending states, we see this similar oscillation between countries deploying more workers and reactively restricting movement in accordance to reports of abuse. And we, again, reflecting significant benefits that are conferred on them from low-wage migration out of labour sending countries. So, in terms of the benefits that are conferred on them, it's considered migration is considered a key way of addressing poverty, relieving unemployment pressures, and fueling growth in labour sending countries, and an important generator of foreign exchange. In the Philippines, Philippines and Vietnam were both in the top 10 global recipients of migrant remittances in 2014. Philippines with $28 billion US dollars, which is 25% of GDP, and Vietnam with 11 billion, which is 11% of GDP. So significant component of GDP in these countries. The benefits of migrant workers are considered so significant in the case of Philippines and Indonesia that they actually set targets for numbers going overseas. And these have increased over time. So looking at labour sending countries, what we can see in the case of the Philippines, for example, is that there was a case of a domestic worker in 1995 called Contemplacion. This is a very high-profile case that you've probably heard of. So the death penalty was applied for a domestic worker in Singapore. Helen Nesarai's work, she's arguing that the Malaysian government learnt from this process of not responding quick enough or harshly enough to reports of the abuse of domestic workers, that then generated a very different response in the case of the Malaysian government deporting migrant workers in 2002. So the Philippines government has reactively responded to reports of abuse and sought to improve migrant work, the conditions of its migrant workers overseas, but within the bounds of facilitating deployments. NGOs who've criticised the Philippine government, I believe, for not overall changing its policy on sending workers overseas. And the Philippine Labour Attaché in Singapore, Vincent Carbe, this was reflected in his attitude. He noted that sending states have to work, within the system of recipient countries, and that the Philippines has to understand that recipient countries have to balance their interests. So very much the emphasis is on expanding worker deployments, which is considered a win-win-win situation in the Philippines, according to Batistella, where he said it's a win for the workers, a win for the recruitment agencies, and a win in that it increases inflows of foreign exchange. So in the case of Indonesia, similar dynamics are evident when countries have, so the 2009 moratorium on domestic workers going to Malaysia. Indonesia responded by to reports of abuses of its domestic workers, to preventing them from going to Malaysia. This then led to the development of a memorandum of understanding between Indonesia and Malaysia. Indonesia said that it wanted domestic workers to be granted 1 day off a week, for them not to have to hand in their passports, for the retrenchment of recruitment fees, and for domestic workers to be given a minimum wage. The MOU that came out of the 2-year moratorium was just that workers would be given a day off. They wouldn't have to surrender their passport, but recruitment fees weren't retrenched, and at the same time there wasn't a minimum wage that was set. So flows are very much continued within the bounds, so there's been a push towards improving conditions, but within the boundaries of facilitating flows. Now, rights advocates have been very much crucial in pushing governments, in pushing labour sending countries to demand better conditions for their workers in labour recipient countries. And what ASEAN has done in developing the declaration, the instrument, is also established this ASEAN Forum of Migrant Labour. So rights advocates have become increasingly organised and vocal in the wake of the Asian economic crisis, and in particular around this issue of migrant workers' rights. There's the group Solidarity for Asian People's Advocacy, its task force on ASEAN and migrant workers. And it's been very vocal, very critical, and very present in these spaces. But what ASEAN has done in negotiating these agreements is set up a forum on migrant labour that's intended to provide a forum for dialogue between government officials, workers, and employers' organisations, civil society groups, and the International Organisation of Migration. It's been argued that this creates a potential for the democratising of regional labour migration policy. I take a lot more cynical view on it, which is based on how this particular forum is structured. I think the potential for its forum to advance the protection of migrant workers' rights is very much inhibited by its structure, because ASEAN officials determine who participates. So it's not open to whoever would like to participate. What states do is each member of the Committee of Permanent Representatives will put together a list of organisations that they would like to attend. That list is then circulated amongst the Committee of Permanent Representatives, with each member having the capacity to remove whoever they like from the list, and everyone else is then invited to participate. So all participants have to receive the endorsement of all member states, and it very much ensures that amenable groups are included and dissenters are very easily marginalised. And I think through this it creates a veneer of policy inclusiveness. it creates the ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labour creates a new advocacy target for the increasingly vocal and organised civil society sector in Southeast Asia, but its potential for advancing migrant workers' rights is quite limited. So just in conclusion, and I do apologise for the large amount of text up there, but I argue that ASEAN's differing approaches to governing high and low wage migration is not to do with norms or a lack of political will, but that its differing approaches very neatly intersect with domestic political exigencies. So these approaches enable recipient states to cherry pick from the region's workforce while adjusting their their intake of low wage workers in accordance with economic conditions. Sending countries at the same time can continue to expand worker deployments given the economic benefits conferred on them, while seeking protections within the boundaries of facilitating worker deployments. I think, importantly, ASEAN has accompanied its failed governance of low-wage migration with this forum on migrant labour, which creates a veneer of policy inclusiveness. So overall, officials are able to argue that they're working to address the issues that are associated with significant expansion in intra-ASEAN migration in recent decades, while facilitating flows and continuing to reap the benefits that this trend has conferred. So I think ASEAN's differing approaches to the governance of high and low wage migration it suggests that this regional instrument is not going to be resolved soon, and there is in fact a little imperative to address this issue at all. I might be proven wrong, which would be embarrassing. It's hard to say things about the future. But despite this rhetoric of community building, ASEAN's differing approaches very much further rather than challenge regional inequalities in establishing the ASEAN economic community. That's it for me.
Thank you so much for that wide-ranging talk from the interesting theoretical perspectives to also a lot of fascinating detail about this migration policies that many of us, anyway, I don't think we're aware of. I'm sure there'll be questions, so if you don't mind filling the questions.
Thank you for your enlightening presentation. You ended your talk with a rather pessimistic note. If you were to advise the ASEAN Secretariat for policies, what would you tell them to improve this negative picture that you have just painted?
I don't think the ASEAN, I think the ASEAN Secretariat is largely an administrative body, and I don't think they, I don't think anything would really happen in this space at all. And I don't know if there is any, I don't think there is much of an imperative for the ASEAN Secretariat to be leading this this issue at all. It's very much come from, I think, the underlying domestic conflicts.
Would the three countries, the recipient, you mentioned Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, do you think they can do something, being the key countries?
Yeah, I think they certainly could. So getting rid of retrenching recruitment fees would be crucial, but certainly a lot could happen in this space, but it all goes back to how it's implemented domestically, and I don't think there is the imperative for these countries to regulate this more effectively, given the costs that would then be borne, they would then bear from those regulations. So enforcing giving domestic workers a day off, getting rid of recruitment fees. We've actually, the commercialisation of the recruitment industry in Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaysia and Singapore, has seen recruitment agencies play an increased role. So it would then mean reversing that trend, which I think is highly unlikely. So I just don't think that the imperative is there really for the labour recipient countries to more effectively manage this issue, given the economic benefits conferred of them of having a highly flexible, low-wage migrant workforce. For choice approaches is how the state is defined, and the state in this instance is not defined as a autonomous, independent entity, but more we're talking about transnational class coalitions, effectively, that are gearing this.
Could not ASEAN itself be defined in those terms as well?
As a collection of definitely, and it is, I think, the composition of that particular set of interests that has defined ASEAN historically.
Oh, but I think the ASEAN condition is not different from the global condition, whereby the sending and the receiving countries do not have a similar perspective, and so they put their own interests. And if you look at the countries ASEAN, there is a sending and there's a receiving countries, and it is very difficult to come up to a compromise of leading to equalities in terms of labor. And second, the harmonization of the ASEAN in the first place is not for free flow of people, but free flow of trade and investment and capital. And I think there lies the issue of hesitancy of receiving countries mostly. Or what can the Philippines offer to Malaysia, for instance, in terms of labor? But unless the bilateral or the ASEAN agreement is labor for commodities, something like that, where Philippines can absorb some commodities in return to in exchange of our labor, where we have more, and that can maybe shift the discussion in terms of semblance of equality, commodities and labor in exchange for labor.
Yeah, I guess it's developing shared interest. Yeah.
Actually, I have two questions, so I'll go one at a time. My first question is about what impact, if any, do you think Malaysia, as both a recipient and sending country, Malaysia's taking over of the ASEAN chair this year, will have on these issues, as the AAC implementation is also supposed to come at the end of the year? And then should I just ask my second question as well? Okay, so my second question, I don't know if this is something you've come across, but I do research on this area for Doctors Without Borders, and we focus mainly on asylum seekers and refugees in ASEAN countries. And as the vast majority of ASEAN countries don't legally recognize refugees or asylum seekers as any different than irregular economic migrants, I was wondering if you've come across in your research, if you have any opinions about how this lack of recognition could potentially be affecting ASEAN's, the stalemate or the lack of interest in governments in furthering this.
Sorry, could you repeat the second question?
So because in, like, example, Malaysia, Indonesia, they don't recognize refugees and asylum seekers. So legally, in Malaysia, undocumented economic migrant is the same as a refugee or an asylum seeker. And even though the UNHCR is present, the Malaysian government doesn't formally recognize them. So especially many coming from Myanmar, many Rohingyas coming in. And so these are kind of people that, are in this situation of not being able to be in their state of origin, but being in a place where they cannot legally work, cannot legally have any protection. So I was wondering if you have come across anything about how this could potentially be affecting the declaration, or how any of the ASEAN instruments.
Yeah, so Malaysia so on the second question, Malaysia opposed the inclusion of irregular migrants. Didn't want the instrument to refer to regular migrants. It didn't want, so three things. It didn't want the instrument to include irregular migrants, for migrants to bring their families, and for it to be legally binding. So I think that reflects the broader issues, this emphasis on on irregular migrants for Malaysia generally. On the issue of Malaysia and its chairmanship, and I think its dual role as a labour recipient and labour sending country, I think, the ASEAN chair, as ASEAN chair this year, is going to be quite a further pushback against what rights activists have have achieved in this space. Malaysia was very one of the most difficult ASEAN chairs last time that it chaired for rights advocates, and I think it's going to be a similar case this time round. Unlike some of the other post-authoritarian states, Thailand and Indonesia and the Philippines have some mechanisms for appointing representatives to these bodies, these new rights agencies, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, on migrant workers and on women and children. But Malaysia continues to appoint its own state reps to these agencies, and in particular it's appointed Shafi Abdullah for the Human Rights, the Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. He's an UMNO lawyer. He has been widely criticised for his own involvement in cases contravening human rights, pursuing the Malaysian state's interests against rights advocates, despite being the Malaysian representative on this rights body. So I think it's going to be quite a pushback against what rights activists have achieved in Malaysia. Thank you.
Kelly, actually, before I ask my question, just I wouldn't put Thailand in the post-authoritarian category anymore. But,
not anymore, no.
I'm just wondering if you sort of turn your question around and instead of asking what is ASEAN doing, ask, should we expect ASEAN to be doing anything at all? I mean, we started the premise, a lot of scholars, and I have to admit I belong to this group, tend to think that it doesn't do much of it, and are very skeptical of what it does, and even the new economic community, there's skepticism about that. There's some enthusiasm and so on, but always the question is, do the actions ever measure up to the words? So there's a general skepticism. And also giving the conflicting interests. But I just wondered, the thought experiment I was wondering is if you take, for example, a case of, this seems to be a somewhat similar case, of say the US and Mexico, where obviously US policy also oscillates between the obvious need in the labor market for these irregular migrants and the pressing by some political forces, Obama at the moment, and so on, to recognize that, and other forces, of course, pushing to have a policy of restrictive and sending migrants on, a little bit like the Malaysian example you talked about, and then the interests of Mexico as a sending country and so on. I mean, is there any real difference between what we're talking about here and say the U.S.-Mexican case? It's just a question of interest of sending and recipient countries, or does it maybe matter that people are at least sitting at the same table, that formally the recipient and sending states are equal, and that there is some sense of an ASEAN community, and maybe if in that very minimalist sense there is a certain difference that ASEAN makes, but that's sort of the most positive interpretation I can come up with of this issue.
I certainly support your skepticism, and it's really quite painful reading ASEAN documents day in and day out of documenting the various meetings where nothing happens. So I certainly support your skepticism, but this paper and I guess this project is situated in a space of looking at why anything has happened here at all, why these various rights agencies, human rights, rights of women and children, and migrant workers' rights, and sure, it's about political rebranding, but it's also, I think, a question of how that speaks to particular domestic issues and the regional organisation of activists. So I think coming at it from that lens. And I think one important thing that's often overlooked is the benefits for sending states, and how that while they are present in all these meetings and while they are saying we want you to look after our migrant workers better, they are doing that within the limits of facilitating greater numbers of workers going overseas. So, yeah, I think it's just taking a much more nuanced perspective, a more detailed perspective on that skepticism, I think, and supporting it with looking at how these conflicts are playing out across governance scales.
Thanks for the presentation, very interesting. I wanted to ask, you identify economic interest domestically as one of the key factors. I was wondering whether there are also within ASEAN transnational economic interests, whether there's a transnational elite across ASEAN that is also shaping the dynamics of change, or whether it's purely domestic interest of different elites at different countries, right?
Yeah, I would be speaking beyond my knowledge, but I think there is. But I don't have. I'm not. I haven't done research into the particular entities. The Singaporean companies and their economic interests across countries and how that they. Yeah, so I think so, but this is going beyond. But certainly, Lee Jones and Gerard, their work looking at the regulation of non-traditional security issues and how that has been mapped out through, the involvement of particular transnational companies in that process, I think gets much more to that.
Just pick up on a few points. I would tend to head in Mark's direction a little bit by asking some comparative questions to get at some of the theoretical issues. You referred to some interesting literatures during the presentation, and so by bringing in different instances of labor regulation or non-regulation or governance or non-governance of migrants. Another case might be Europe. You could begin to think about, if perhaps you haven't already, some of the contributions to the broader literature, thinking comparatively so as to get at the theoretical question. Secondly, with respect to Ruben's point, I would think that if you're developing a sort of analysis of states in the region as sites of conflict, that heading in the direction, particularly in the context of transnationalization or even ASEAN economic community, if you want to be excessively optimistic, that nonetheless, the development of some sort of firm level analysis across the region would be helpful, because it would, at the very least, facilitate the drawing of connections between national states and national capitals and networks of accumulation around the region. You could take that in multiple directions. And then finally, if what is potentially most interesting and ultimately redeeming, something that can rescue you from the ASEAN documentation and its associated emotional impact, it is to embrace the neo-Gramscian. And if you're it's hard to embrace neo-Gramscianism when everybody's getting a raw deal, but if, for example, you're interested in counter-hegemonic struggle of these folks with very limited power, nonetheless, it'd be interesting to ask whether or not there's any significant variation across the region with respect to how workers and the people who are and their relations act within the broader context of social relations, not necessarily looking for some successful case, probably not one, but developing a deeper analysis of class politics within different states in ASEAN, one would expect, for example, that labor-state relations vary across cases like Burma, Philippines, Indonesia.
So thank you for those comments.
Even at a sectoral level.
Yeah.
Or within what do they call it? A multiple geographers. You want to correct me? What do they call it? Multi-scalar analysis of regional accumulation. Is that right?
So thank you for those points. Just on the final one thing I found interesting from the last set of interviews I did was talking to people in the CLMV countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam. The government officials there were very keen to get unions happening in those countries because they were told by all the companies that were setting up there that they need unions. But obviously the scope for what unions could do in that space is interesting. But anyway, and definitely the firm level analysis is the third chapter in the book I haven't written yet. Sorry. That's to come. Thank you.
Sort of following on from that, and I really enjoyed the presentation, it was great, but just wondering to what degree in the paper you sort of drill down on the sections of capital, the role of the petty bourgeoisie in places like Singapore as beneficiaries of this arrangement, and sections of labour as well, and give sort of insight into the degree to which those groups are placing pressure on the state or have no ability to place pressure on the state. To sort of achieve some of the outcomes that you're talking about. I mean, that sort of granular detail I think would be great.
Yeah. Yes, we need to do more of that.
So which groups are actually pushing for ASEAN-wide migrant labor protection? Or to use, you said you draw upon Palacios, to use his language, the condensation of social forces in these social struggles.
Which groups in particular?
And why? And are they choosing to pressure ASEAN more than their national social formations?
So they are choosing now to pressure ASEAN alongside doing things in the domestic space. So many groups, it wasn't until the Asian economic crisis after that groups began targeting ASEAN as part of ASEAN's big agenda for a people-oriented, people-centered, people-something ASEAN. Then groups started targeting ASEAN, and since then we've seen this development of various policy consultations done in a highly structured and in a highly segmented fashion as to who can participate and how those groups can participate.
But they target ASEAN more than their national states.
I think it's their strategies that occur alongside one another, rather than one over the other necessarily. But the interesting thing I think that's happening amongst these groups is the regional organisation, the development of alliances across groups in developing a region-wide platform to target ASEAN. Bill?
I wonder if I could ask you just an easier one. Can you tell us something about this notorious organization, RELA?
RELA.
Why it's taken up this vigilante role with such enthusiasm? Is this a support group for UMNO? Is this are they in competition with low-wage labor migrants who are coming from Indonesia? Are they on a power trip, or what is it actually?
I don't know. Does anyone know more about RELA? I can't actually comment.
Okay, Bill, you do.
Well, if you don't know that part, let me ask you the second part. And it's this: if there are structural imperatives to this kind of vigilante behaviors in Malaysia, do we find some of this in Thailand then too? Because it seems that they would suffer from much the same sort of emotively charged resentments over the arrival of these people, and so maybe we might see similar organizations there as well. Is there anything like this, a counterpart?
Not that I've come across, but the Thai specialists in the room might be able to comment on that more significantly.
How about the third part?
You have not about Thailand, but about RELA. From what I understand is that the kind of peak of their power, brutality, kick, seems to have passed. I know in the last, Malaysia just ended an amnesty program, the 6P program, and unlike in the 2005 program, it was aimed at employers, so employers were allowed to hand over their undocumented migrants, and then the employers did not get fined, whereas they normally would. So instead of before where they would send RAILA members out to conduct raids, this was asking employers to bring people in on their own. And I think part of this change also came because RAILA originally was paid per capture, so paid per undocumented migrant, but this was also taken away. So I do think that there has been some backlash. They still exist and they still recruit, and they have a very active Facebook page that you can all check out. But I think that the degree of notoriety they got did inspire a little bit of pulling back. How, if that will last, who's to say, but.
Just a comment on the Thai case. It's interesting. I don't see the vigilante side strongly, but the one thing about the Thai case, of course, recently is the human trafficking aspect, and particularly in the fisheries industry, but in some others as well. That's been very embarrassing for Thailand, and you know, that makes you wonder if that is. And then the current military government has actually promised to do something about that. What exactly they'll do is a little unclear, but. That's maybe also maybe a force that pushes. And it's a little bit similar to, when you get bad publicity like that, that's one thing, particularly bad international press in this case, international report pointing to Thailand as one of the most notorious human trafficking countries, that puts pressure on them.
On that note, it's worth, I would like to ask, if you have any sense of the scale of the trafficking, of the so-called, the dark numbers, the numbers of trafficked persons in comparison to the official data that you presented. Does that cover that? Is there any sense of the scale?
That data was, was not counting traffic.
Yeah.
I don't have any figures on it. I haven't seen the same. The UN database is great in terms of that, in terms of counting irregular migrants, but
it'd be interesting to have some sense of scale of that in comparison.
Also, did those numbers in your table include undocumented workers, or just
yes?
It does.
Yeah, well, where estimates where possible. Yeah.
How much are sort of non-regionally based organisations involved? I mean, at the start you mentioned, or you cited ILO statistics. So an organisation such as an ILO, I mean, to what extent, if any, is it the target of lobbying activities, or in turn does it lobby itself? Are these part of the story at all?
Yeah, they are. So the IOM's been very significant in its involvement in establishing the ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labour, saying that we need to have a space for which people can sit down, and including civil society groups. I don't think that they intended for ASEAN governments to just invite their buddies to that meeting, but they've been very much involved in that process. Similarly, the ILO and other what's called NGO forum, government organisation, non-governmental organisation forums. So these stakeholder consultations, they've been very much involved. The Canadian government's been very much involved in the establishment of the ASEAN Committee on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children and related NGOs. So a lot of and I think the Australian government similarly in the Philippines in particular, different programs, similar programs taking place there. Yeah.
Just add one more further comment. Back to the granular analysis of firms, it'd be interesting to have some sense of the use of migrant workers among firms from other places, Taiwan, Korea, and so on, maybe.
But you mentioned that most of the sectors that migrant workers are in are domestic workers, entertainment, which I guess is the sex industry, construction. So these are non-exportable sectors, right? So
no, but for example, in the Thai case, they set up a whole lot of factories on the Myanmar border when Myanmar was politically isolated. as a way of facilitating workers commuting from Myanmar. So in that, in those sectors, yeah, very much transnational.
Yeah. Well, it was a Walmart supplier that was, what you mentioned, the Thai fishing jacket. It was a Walmart supplier that provided this.
I teach globalization here in this university, and I'm always looking for positive effects of globalization. I don't deny the dark side of the many problems that it creates, but this particular issue you're talking about is kind of a mini globalization within ASEAN, and therefore it serves the supply and demand of labor, like Singapore needs and all that stuff. So you already mentioned the benefit, the economic benefit is 25% of GDP, together with other workers from other parts of the world. In the case of the Philippines, 11% for Vietnam in percentage of GDP. But there are many other positives that can be seen. For example, the development of jurisprudence in every country, the way they treat them, the way the courts will handle the problems. You mentioned also the harmonization of the recognition of qualifications, and that's very important because, you know, basically what's happening is you are forcing the governments to deal with problems that they probably would not have dealt with if this did not happen. So in the short term, we probably only will see the black spots, but over time, you will see like lots of harmonization, even pressuring the governments to, for example, take care of migrant workers, which now they look like it's like a piecemeal approach. They have a problem and that's it. They will deal with it. But if you put all of this together, so maybe in 15 years, 20 years, we will see that the problems now will lead to a better situation. Do you think that's going to happen?
I think this idea of governments being forced to do anything in this context is highly, I think it's just not what we observe. I think it's very much shaped by particular countries leading this process in particular areas that suit them. So, in setting up these framework arrangements, they've taken the 2+X approach, which means that not all countries have to agree. I think the process of developing the ASEAN economic community is very much is highly contingent on particular domestic agendas. So I think the ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labour creates another space for contestation for activists, but apart from that, I don't think that there is this broader betterment process that will go on, I think.
I have a question on Singapore.
Yeah.
The government has introduced further restrictions on migrant workers coming into Singapore. Do you see this as a temporary measure, or is it something that will, following massive public pressure to put further restrictions on immigration in Singapore for recently?
So Singapore, compared to the other labour recipient countries, is the only one that is seeking to reduce its emphasis on migrant workers, and in particular low-wage migrant workers. And I think, based on the Little India riots, that this is going to continue very much so into the future.
Well, if there are no further questions, again, thank you very much, Kelly, and also thanks to the audience for a lively discussion. And,
thank you for that.